will start our first presentation from Anne Gilliland, Department of Information Studies, University of California, Los Angeles. The topic will be ethical principles and practical quandaries around metadata. UCLA 저명한 교수님이신 앤 길릴랜드께서 윤리적 원칙, 메타데이터가 마주하는 실질적인 장벽 어려움에 대해서 발표해 주시겠습니다. 앤 길릴랜드.
Thank you very much indeed. I'd like to thank the organizers very much for having this opportunity to come back to Seoul. This is one of my favorite places to come to visit. I've been here several times before. And I want to congratulate you also on developing this archive. This is an incredibly important piece of history, and having it recognized by the UNESCO Memory of the World project as well. And what I'm going to do today, I am an archival studies person, I'm an archivist, and I'm going to basically do something fairly straightforward here. I'm going to set up a variety of questions that relate to this development, and I know that my colleagues who are coming after me, many of them will address some of these questions, but it isn't very often that we get to design an archive from scratch. It's a really exciting opportunity to be able to do that and to build something that is scalable and expandable and can reach out from one space of the world across all of the rest of the globe. So what I'm going to do, first of all, I'm just going to make a few comments about the National Debt Redemption Movement Archive and some of its possible scope. And then I want to say a little bit about the nature of archives more generally. I know some of you in the room are archives people, but not everybody is. And so maybe some of these comments are very obvious to you, but I think they're important to say. And then I want to mention some of the directions that the archival field has been moving in, particularly critical and ethical questions that have been coming up. I'm thinking about how some of those issues might be addressed through the design of this archive. And then the third thing I want to do is just to raise some questions and difficulties that come up when we think about metadata. It's sort of a truism about archives that eventually they become almost more about the metadata than about the content, and I'll explain why that is. And that presents us with some practical problems. Go backwards. Okay, so the National Debt Redemption Movement Archive really is a new kind of archive. It's not just a new archive, but it is an archive that has many different ideas behind it. The idea that you could build an archive that meets many different functions simultaneously is actually something that's quite complicated to bring into reality. An archive that can speak to multiple audiences simultaneously, to different agendas, and with that come different needs. And then affect as well, the kinds of emotions that are bound up with an archive, whether it is national pride, whether it is sort of happiness to see your story revealed, whether it's something darker as well. So what are some of the functions that this archive could perform? One is obviously as a national repository. This is a major piece of Korean history. And when we think about national repositories in archives, we think about an entity that has a certain authority and a certain standing and a state commitment behind it But of course, with any kind of national standing, there may come an element of politicization. This is an archive, though, that reflects very closely the stories of individuals in Korea and the histories of individuals. This was a movement that people participated in all across Korea. So it has close community connections as well. And those communities are here inside Korea. They may possibly also be in the Korean diaspora across the globe. I live in Los Angeles. It has a very, very large Korean community as well. And those different populations may want to engage in different ways with this archive. For varying reasons. They may represent different generations. They may represent different uses of language or different politics. They may know more or less about the national debt redemption movement. And then the third function is, as was already alluded, the building of a global profile and the use of this archive globally. So that's always a daunting idea for any archives. We tend to be very tied to the national or local space that we work in, and we also know those audiences best, and we work in our own languages. So as we stretch across the globe, it raises some interesting and more complicated questions. And the kinds of uses that you might see being made of this archive from outside Korea, certainly educational, and educational in all sorts of different spaces, with younger children, with undergraduate students, with students who are in graduate or postgraduate programs, maybe also educating scholars on how to use the archives, or educating local communities. And obviously scholarly uses, possibly policy and political uses, and professionals, other information and archival professionals looking at this archive around the world and seeing it as a model for something that they might be able to build themselves. At the same time that this is a new archive, it's also one that has a long history. And since the materials relating to the national debt redemption movement were created, there have, of course, been many shifts in generations and many shifts politically here in Korea and in other parts of the world. It is an archive. It's not a library, and I think that means that we approach working with the source material often in somewhat different ways. And it is, as I already mentioned, this unique opportunity to design a model archives from scratch. So we hope that the design of the archives, as well as its content, both will reflect the prominence of the national debt redemption movement. So if I say a little bit now about the nature of archives, archives have, if we read the literature about archives, we talk a lot about their organic nature. Archives really are living entities, even archives that have collections of material that were created nearly 100 years ago, they don't stay static. Archives constantly can be revisited, they can be mined, they can be compiled in new ways, and by doing that, we can generate all sorts of new insights, new narratives, new responses to the archives, really infinitely. And this will happen as new audiences come to the archive. It will happen as new research questions are asked against the archive. It will happen when we apply new technologies, for example, deep learning technologies to the archive. It will happen as we build more metadata into the archives and we revise existing metadata that will allow us to scaffold new kinds of searches. And quite likely, more content will be added into the archive over time. So the archive will actually continue to accrue content. Archives also have really important interrelationships between documents that make them, those relationships very interesting things to work with. So we don't just look at the content of individual documents, we look at the relationships of documents to each other. And as we do so, we're concerned about the evidential value of archives as well as about the information that is in their content. In this case, the evidence is what it can tell us about the context within which the documents were created. What does it tell us about the creators of the documents? What does it tell us about the series of events that unfolded? Archives, however, they also need to be trusted, and they need to be able to demonstrate that their content is trustworthy. And the thing that supports all of this tends to be metadata. So where we talk in all information fields a lot about descriptive metadata, we have to talk about many other kinds of metadata in archives as well. Oh, there we are. Is that it? So, all right, sorry. So one of the truisms of the digital world is that people, the public, tended to have a lot of trust in archives, in libraries when they were physical and they were bricks and mortar. But when we move into a digital world, we have to earn that trust because people don't have automatically as much trust in the digital space as they do in the physical space. So what that means for archives is that they have to be able to do all these things that we can see here on the screen. And these are things that we would ask of records creators if we are trying to hold governments and bureaucracies accountable, but we have to stick to the same standards ourselves. So we have to be transparent. That means we must document how we make the decisions about how the archives is created and put together. And for example, if we're engaged in digital preservation, what the decisions and the processes are that lead to continuing to make digital copies, migrating content. So we have to document all our actions. This is a kind of metadata. It's not descriptive metadata, it's a different kind of metadata. We have to be accountable. So when we take actions, we have to take responsibility for the implications of those, and we should learn from our experiences. We have to be up to date. We are professionals. We need to stay up to date with changing professional practices and discourse. At the same time, we need to be reflexive. As archivists, we in many ways shape the historical record through our decisions. We need to think about constantly who we are and why we do what we do, so we understand what our presence brings to the shape of the historical record that is passed on to future generations. And we need to look critically at previous practices and priorities and say, why were they that way? Should they be that way? Should we continue them? Should we reprioritize because times have changed? Archives have to be preserved and they have to be sustainable. And when we're talking about digital archives, that is a very hands-on activity. We can never leave archives unmanaged or unpreserved. And we have to, in order to be trusted there, we have to ensure that we have adequate expertise and we demonstrate that expertise. And as I said, we have continuity of stewardship and we have the necessary resources to do that. And finally, I would say that we need to be consultative. We need to understand not only what our own expertise is as professionals, but when we need to reach out and seek advice from experts whose expertise lies outside our own. And that may include, from time to time, also community experts. So, having mentioned community, I wanted to just spend a minute here and talk about something that those of you who are archives colleagues here will already know about, but maybe not so much outside that. What is called the Community Archives Movement, which is a big development that is happening in many places around the globe, have really challenged some traditional ideas about archives. And if we are talking about reaching out to communities and having communities participate in the development and the life of this archive, we have to ask some really important questions. So one of the ethoses of the Community Archives Movement is that the communities themselves participate in the development and the management and the decisions that are made by an archive. And so we could ask questions about, how participatory should this National Debt Redemption Movement archive be, or how participatory could it be? And to backtrack from that, step back from that just for a minute, what does community mean in the context of this archive? Who would be the relevant communities? What would be their interests? And what would they want to achieve by participating? And if we could answer that question, then we would be able to ask how would be the most effective way to engage those communities in the life of the archive. And that leads to another question about who would be able to speak for the communities and what they wish and what they need. Communities are not one single entity. They're made up of lots of different kinds of people, people from different generations, with different political persuasions. How do we build that into the archive? And then what kind of metadata would these different kinds of users want to have for the archive? And could they even contribute some of that metadata? So if we move on then to think a little bit about metadata further, and here I'm thinking mostly about descriptive metadata. How do we ensure that our metadata is really sensitive to different cultural backgrounds and different cultural contexts and actually responds to that? Are metadata standards that we could apply actually the appropriate ones in different cultural contexts? And even if they are they sufficient, or do they need to be augmented in some way? Do we need to include some terminology that we don't find yet in standardized thesauri? Should we be developing a specialized thesaurus, for example? Is it possible that different users or different source communities might be able to annotate or tag content themselves? And if they did, what kind of guidelines would we need to put in place? And then who owns that metadata if it's contributed by people who are not those who are the actual developers of the archive? Another issue that comes up, it may not be an issue in the case of this archive, is if communities are involved, do they actually not want to have all of the content made available globally or publicly, but maybe made available only to certain people or under certain conditions? And this is usually about sensitive material, or the ability to yield sensitive information from how you compile the content. And a final question about the actual mode of delivering digital archives online. If we have a physical archives, we would have a reference archivist who worked with people who were using the archives. And that reference archivist works to contextualize content when it's provided to users. Not everybody who uses an archive is a scholar in the field of the content that they're looking at. When we move into a digital world, often there is no equivalent of a physical reference archivist to work with users. So that changes the discussion about how much information they should have about not only how to use the archive, but what is the content that they're looking at, and what are its characteristics that they should be paying attention to. So I just want to finish up with a few sort of practical questions. One of them has to do with when you have many different kinds of user groups, many different audiences, and maybe you've got different generations as well, how do you support multiple or potentially competing perspectives and narratives? So do you just have an archive that has one narrative that is projected, or do you make it possible for multiple narratives to be projected or to be contributed to the archive? Is it possible with the metadata standards we have available to us to be able to show disagreement or parallel narratives using descriptive metadata? We do have to ask also about whether the metadata standards and vocabularies we have actually are the appropriate ones in a particular context, in this case a Korean context. Can we include many different kinds of metadata in order to help support different narratives and different interpretations? And how would we do that? Could we have parallel metadata maybe contributed by different people for the same content that read the material in different ways or interpret it in different ways? Or would that completely confuse users? As I mentioned earlier, could users contribute their own metadata? And what about when we want to use the archive for educational purposes? There are specialized metadata sets out there for educational and learning purposes. Would we use those? How would we scaffold the archive to support different kinds of education? And through all of that, how do we make sure that we haven't confused everybody, that this archive is transparent, it is accountable, it's clear, it's usable? Of course, this gets more complicated when you try to reach cross-language spaces as well, and also, of course, moving across different scripts as well. So if we create metadata in Korean and we want to make metadata, we want to make the content available to people who are in other language spaces, maybe English, maybe French, maybe Japanese. How do we ensure that that metadata that we create in those languages actually either says the same thing that it says in Korean, so that's about semantic equivalency, or actually is more culturally appropriate for the language group that you're reaching out to? And as you move, of course, across communities and generations and histories, you move across different ways that the same language is used. And do you use an archaic term? Do you use the most recent term? What about terms that have changed meaning and perhaps are no longer as polite as they were when they were first used? And the final thing I want to say, and then I'm going to turn it over, I think, to Wayne next, is that all of this metadata, and I did say I would talk a lot about metadata because that's really what the glue that holds together archives, is how do we manage all of that metadata? We have so many different kinds, and it keeps accumulating. How do we keep our metadata up to date? how do we make sure that we're not keeping too much metadata? How would we perhaps go in and, again, for those of you who know anything about records management, maybe do some retention scheduling of metadata so that we don't have to deal with, you know, preservation issues of digital metadata that is really extensive and in a lot of different formats, to the point where it becomes really cumbersome to manage. And I guess I would leave you with the final question about, you know, how do we evaluate the effectiveness of our metadata to make sure that it's actually doing the job that we've set it up to do, and all of the tasks that the archive is designed to do based on that metadata. How do we evaluate that they also are effective, they're efficient, they're sufficient as well? So I'm just going to leave you with those thoughts and turn it over to Wayne. Thank you.